Mark, welcome back into the back room.
Thanks, Andy. Pleasure as always, I think.
I don't know, pleasure. That's an interesting word. It depends how you define it, I guess. Let's start with the major breaking news late yesterday that Disney is bringing back Jimmy Kimmel live tonight after a week of our collective mourning over the perceived death of free speech. So, in your opinion, how consequential is this decision?
I mean, look, I think it's likely a business decision, just as the initial decision was. That's a problem with corporate media nowadays. I doubt. I'm sure there were some within the Disney Corporation who felt very strongly that, hey, we shouldn't bow to the administration and the implicit, if not explicit, threats from the FCC about we can do it the easy way, we can do it the hard way,
Mhm.
which we don't know what that frankly means. He said it on a podcast, but there were definitely free speech issues, and it is reminiscent. And I'm not going the Nazi route, but I'm going the authoritarian route. 1938, 39, Goebbels in Nazi National Socialist Germany did the exact same thing against comedians.
Mhm.
Comedians who were critical of the Hitler regime were removed from being able to appear, and there were efforts that the Germans made around the world to try and get banned comedians who would criticize Hitler. And that is exactly the same thing that happened here. I don't think when I first heard the Kimmel comment, I heard it listening in the car to the television news. So I didn't see the visual image that accompanied I hesitate to call it a joke. I don't think it was a joke. It was this opening monologue. It was a statement. If you just
Mhm.
heard it, there was nothing funny about it. I don't think it was intended to be funny. It was a commentary. And you needed to, I guess, see the video really that accompanied, where he was asked about uh, Charlie Kirk. How do you feel, sir, about your friend? And he's like, yeah, whatever it was. He said, I'm doing okay. And by the way, look at the ballroom we're building over there. Uh, and that made it a little bit, I wouldn't say funny, more sad than anything else. But the reaction of the Trump administration and Brendan Carr, the chair of the FCC, that threatened Disney's license, but it hasn't ended, even though Disney's decided to put him back on air because Sinclair, I don't know if Nexstar made the
Mhm.
decision yet, but Sinclair, that owns dozens of ABC affiliates around the country, predominantly, if not all, in red states, is not putting Kimmel back on its air. It's
Mhm.
going to put something else in its place. So there is still political censorship on our television stations, but they favor Donald Trump. So, of course, no one in the administration is going to react. So I think it's a dangerous, slippery slope, but I don't necessarily applaud Disney bringing him
Right.
back, because I have no doubt that what was happening were financial conversations, both between Kimmel's people and Disney, of what's this going to cost if you don't bring me back, in by whatever his contract says, or potential litigation, who knows, or what's it going to cost us. I've heard some stat, and I think they were just throwing it out there. Let's say 60% of the country is totally in favor of Jimmy Kimmel, or at least being on the air. Like, I don't watch Jimmy Kimmel myself, but he should be on the air if that's what ABC wants, from a commercial standpoint. And 40% don't. Hey, well, 60-40, that's kind of an easy commercial decision to make. And that's what it probably was.
Yeah. I'm sure on some level, too, Bob Iger didn't want America's Neville Chamberlain etched on his tombstone one day. So I want to ask you, you say this is not over, and you're right. But do you expect Trump and the government and the FCC to take any retaliatory action here against Disney? And if so, and this ends up going to court, let's say, somehow, who might have the stronger legal case?
I wouldn't doubt that whether or not the administration ratchets it up this a little bit more may be dependent on what does Kimmel do the evening he comes back.
Right.
Folks have already started to discuss it. I haven't heard anything issued from Kimmel's people or folks close to him other than, I guess, friends will say the guy's a real stubborn guy. So, the likelihood he's not going to apologize. I don't think he should. There's nothing to apologize for. Will he try to clarify the remarks? Will he try to mollify the administration a bit? Will he take it head on and make jokes and further commentary about it, which frankly, I hope he does. If the FCC removes him, then, whether he has legal action or Disney does, it's really factually dependent on the circumstances. So if just looking at what happened so far, if it repeated that, if one, we don't know like what that hard way, easy way comment meant, right? I mean, that doesn't mean they were going to take him off the air. I mean, that's what was certainly assumed. But anyone who knows the Odd Couple from the late 1960s knows never to assume. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, Google Odd Couple assume. One of the best scenes ever that I use all the time for work and personal life. It's a great scene. And if Disney had denied that he had been removed by pressure from the FCC, then any lawsuit against the government by Kimmel would no doubt fail. There could have been interference with contract between the government and Disney in a case against the government, but those are really difficult. And I have a feeling the government would likely have sovereign immunity under that anyway. So the odds are the best lawsuit that Kimmel would have if he were removed would just be a contract breach between him and Disney, of which would probably be settled when it really came down to it, because why would either side want to go to trial, especially Disney, on that? But, we got to wait and see what happens. And I really do think, I've said this since January, and it's sad that I'm saying it now. It feels like 8 years later. It's only, 8 months. We're not even close to where this administration is going to sink to. Not even close. These are all baby steps that it's taking. Wait till someone really says something or does something that embarrasses or pisses off someone senior in the administration. Stephen Miller, J.D. Vance, one of the Trump kids, I don't know. And we'll see what happens then if an entire network is forced to go dark, or someone is completely blackballed in some way. It's just one step of many. And they how's it go? I'm blanking on the saying, take an inch, give a foot. I don't know, whatever it is. But I mean, that's what we're really seeing with this administration more than anything else. I mean, I think people need to understand what we're seeing is the fragility of our democratic system that has always been this way in all of our lifetime, but norms have always controlled. There were certain lines where you just didn't cross. You're at the top of the Grand Canyon, and there's some places maybe there's not any fencing or anything, but instinctively, don't go too close to the edge, don't look over, and certainly don't step over. This administration, there is no fence whatsoever. But it's because this is new, because no one has ever done it this way, including in the first term. They're taking things inch by inch to see what the reaction is. And the reality is, sadly, most of the reactions are either minimal or short-lived. Or even if it's somewhat loud, it's ineffectual against them. So they go, all right, we can take a little bit more this next time. And then it just keeps going and keeps going. And this is why whenever I'm talking about rule of law, giving speeches on the topic, I'm always reminding people of Pastor Martin Niemöller. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing the German name, of the famous poem where he talks about, they came for the socialists and I didn't say anything because I'm not a socialist. Came for the communists. I didn't say anything. I'm not a communist. Came for the Jews. I didn't say anything. I'm not a Jew. Then they came for me and there was no one left to say anything. So I encourage people, we need to speak out now loudly and in opposition to what's happening.
Well, on that note, and maybe this is why they call me Optimistic Andy, which is rapidly devolving into naive Andy, according to some. Are we at some kind of inflection point where Trump and the administration has gone too far? Because they faced a lot of pushback on this particular issue. I mean, come on, when you have Ted Cruz coming out and vociferously condemning this attack on free speech, and there was a lot of other people in Congress, in the right-wing media ecosystem, it seemed to be an issue that was starting to unite the left and the right, which we don't have a lot of those these days. And certainly out on Main Street, people across the aisles seemed pretty upset about this. I mean, this is what they ran on. Charlie Kirk himself presented himself as a big proponent of free speech, and that's what his followers loved about him. And so are we at an inflection point, you think, or as I think you're alluding to, we are perhaps entering Act Two in the play, America, the Autocracy?
No, I view them, they're just dipping their toes in the water to see if it's hot or cold, warm, whatever it might be, to see about what that next step is. Kudos to Ted Cruz for criticizing that step that especially the statement that Brendan Carr made. I mean, the reality is the success of challenging this administration and preventing us from going full authoritarian or really patrimonialistic, which is really, I think, more of what we are, which I can discuss because I didn't know what that word meant until a few months ago, even though it's a centuries plus old term, but it's a related form of authoritarianism. The opposition to the current administration has got to come from within. I mean, the other side's already opposed, and they don't care. There's a reason why McCarthy went down in disgrace. It was because of his fellow Republicans. There's a reason why Nixon resigned rather than stay in office. It was because of his fellow Republicans. It wasn't because of the Democrats. Obviously, the Democrats played a role in all of it, and as well as the public did. But it needed to come from the same political party for this to work. And we'll see what the midterms bring about. Although I started to think, as we're now, almost a year into the administration, and the midterms are only in a year, which will go by really slow and really fast at the same time in some weird time distortion. If the Democrats won the Senate and the House in 2026, which is possible, and I hate speculating on it because today is not November 2026, and who knows what could happen in between. But if we just worked it out and that they did win, the notion of the MAGA movement being defeated is not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
It will still be as vibrant as ever. And clearly, if both houses went to the Democrats, Trump is being impeached, and removed. There's no doubt about that. That we can predict. And then Vance presumably would step up, unless he gets impeached too. Who the heck knows? But the response to that from the MAGA right and probably just the conservative right will be intense. I mean, I started thinking about this reason. I wonder if that might even make it worse in the short term than the long term, because I don't think we would have reconciled yet with what we have just gone through in order to find sort of a peaceful moderation. I mean, I have my optimism is I look at Germany and Japan, and Germany obviously from the genocidal aspect, which I don't think we're going to, but I don't think most Americans realize how militaristic and horrific Japan was in the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s. We only always hear about the Nazis, and yet if anybody thought for the most part about the Japanese people in our lifetime, we think about one, they're really peaceful, no military, Godzilla, and manga, and cool TV shows and things like that. I mean, they made such a transformation because they were so stunned out of, I guess, what they were as a people under the emperor, and then transformed into this really peaceful society, which doesn't mean they don't have issues. They're very misogynistic at times, and you always hear stories about American women being groped on trains and things like that, but not to laugh about it. But I mean, every society's got problems, no doubt. But I think, at least kind of swinging back to the question with the criticism from the right, yeah, it's like just a temporary stall. And the one thing that of course they do is, and this is really hard it's a great strategy if this is actually intentional, a million things at once, right? We can't keep up. We can't keep dousing every fire that happens. So if it's not the FCC at this moment, they'll move on to the next, more ICE recruitment for folks, some action with the immigration deportation, some firing of someone else. They're constantly keeping me in business by all the firings that they do.
I want to get to that in a second, but what safeguards, legal or otherwise, should be in place to ensure that public figures like Jimmy Kimmel and others can still engage in satire and criticism without fear of reprisal?
I will say, even though that case did not enter into the judicial regime, right now, for optimism, it is the courts.
Right.
I mean, the courts are holding steadfast about how this, in protecting the democratic system. If you look at our three branches of government, we've lost the executive branch in the sense that they took over, and the legislative branch willingly conceded, which I don't get, and that will be a very interesting historical analysis of how the Republicans just caved. And I'm not even talking about in the sense of giving in not opposing their own party's executive branch authority, which they may be in support of. If that's the case, that's what makes sense. I'm talking about the executive branch flouting legislative branch authority, disregarding laws that Congress, the Republican Congress, passed, doing things that are outright illegal because Congress said it is, and the legislative branch just capitulating and not saying anything to challenge the executive branch. That's the whole notion of separation of powers, to make sure that those powers, the power of the purse, remains in the hands of the legislature. And they've allowed that and ceded that to the executive branch, the Republicans, clearly not the Democrats on that. But the judiciary has held firm. And, there was a decision as just within, a day or so of us recording this, where the Supreme Court allowed the Trump administration to fire a senior official. I'm trying to remember, was it at the FCC? I'm trying to remember.
I think it's the FTC.
Federal Trade Commission. There's too many of them. But it wasn't really a substantive decision. It was a procedural decision. And there's actually, I think many of us understand, might not agree with it. I would have rather have seen a different result. But the substantive decision hasn't been made yet. They were really ruling on whether or not lower courts can enjoin the president along the way and keep the person in office instead of being fired. But they still get to challenge their firing. They just can't do it while still in office. They're out of office and they challenge. And if the court rules it was an illegal firing, they'll be put back into place.
And this case, by the way, involves the potential for the Supreme Court to reverse a 90-year-old precedent on executive power in terms of who president can and can't fire, who needs to remain independent.
Humphrey's law, guy's name who got fired was Humphrey back in the FDR administration, FDR administration, 1934. Although he probably got fired maybe in 33. I can't remember how fast the proceedings took. But that will impact a lot of our cases and many of what's the authority of the president of the United States. And I think they scheduled oral arguments for December or
Right.
briefing. I forget which one. So we'll get a decision sometime next year is what we're going to have to wait for. But I mean, we have seen many Trump appointed federal judges rule against the Trump administration. And hey, anytime I see any appointed judge rule against the party, executive party that put it into power, put them into place, into position, that's a good thing because
Yeah.
that's demonstrating rule of law exists and can be maintained. One of my biggest fears, and I do predict that this will happen, I just can't tell you when, is that at some point in time, I think the Trump administration is going to refuse to abide by a Supreme Court order. And in shades of Andrew Jackson, of which it was rumored, he said something to the effect of like, you and what army are going to enforce your decisions, Mr. Chief Justice? That's when we will really hit a constitutional crisis. And then when I for one, as a lawyer, I think I've just lost all my power. If I can't count on the judiciary to enforce the rule of law, then I've got really nothing I can do other than speak out. But what does that do?
Yeah. Well, along these lines, a federal court last week stopped Trump from firing Fed Board Governor Lisa Cook. The case is now headed to the Supreme Court. And these cases, as you point out, which will eventually go to the Supreme Court, I struggle with the idea that the court is going to hand the keys to democracy to Trump. Like, most of these cases are going to the court. But I believe there's a lot of cases that they're going to give him, like they have already, where he just gets to expand his power. But then there are those cases which literally break the Constitution. Like, so for example, tariffs. The language couldn't be clearer in the Constitution. So if they say, okay, you can impose tariffs, they have broken the Constitution, which means they've rendered their own jobs, their own lifetime tenure moot, right? So I feel like he's going to win some, he's going to lose some, but in the end, even though he'll have blitzed through this country and shattered so many norms and boundaries and institutions, democracy will still hold. It may have been weakened, but it will still hold.
I don't know. Optimistic Andy and optimistic Mark are on the same page on that. I mean, we need to keep some level of optimism. I mean, yeah, this is from a personal thing. I mean, my maternal great grandmother killed herself in 1940 because she was originally from Germany. I hate trying to bring it back to the Nazi, but I'm talking about optimism and despair more than anything else. She lost contact with her brother, who remained in Germany, and feared the worst. And she had no idea, right? She had for all she knew, he could have been able to escape to England or somewhere, or was hiding somewhere. But she feared the worst, and she committed suicide. It turned out he had been killed in Dachau. I don't think he was dead by the time she had killed herself. I think he was alive for another 2 years. But that level of despair consumed her, right? That's not what we want at all. In fact, her son, my grandfather, ended up liberating Dachau, which is how he found out his uncle had been murdered earlier in Dachau before he got there. As a rabbi, he was. So I agree. And the Supreme Court, has been steadfast and strong about due process issues. If you look at the Garcia case, the Maryland immigration case, the Maryland man, as some folks unfortunately called him, he may well, and even looks like he should be deported. This is not necessarily the type of person we want in the United States who's breaking a variety of laws, if those allegations are true. And some of them are certainly suspicious factually. But when the Supreme Court was ruling on it, they actually ruled unanimously, as I recall. I think it was 8-0. I think someone must have recused himself, if I remember, that he was entitled to due process, right? It wasn't that the government can't deport him or that he deserves deportation. It was, you need to give him due process so he can challenge the decision. And that's why I continue to have faith that the Supreme Court, even with Justice Clarence Thomas on it, and some couple of the other really conservative justices who typically will rule along the Trump line, even they were steadfast on due process. So for many of these firings, some of which I'm handling, on where they've exercised what they call Article 2 authority under the Constitution, saying, I'm the big boss. I can fire you no matter what, even though there are laws passed by Congress that say, no, that person's entitled to either only be fired by cause or for cause, or some type of negligence, and you need to give them due process. You know, here's a written statement explaining what they did wrong. Here's an opportunity to respond in writing, have an oral reply, have a lawyer, all these really basic norms that I have no doubt 90% of the United States, if you polled them and asked, should someone have an opportunity to defend themselves, would go, yeah, of course, and then fire their ass, after if they deserve it, which is perfectly fine, because that would be normal and legal. I think that's where the Supreme Court is going to hopefully come down and say, no, you don't have the authority. You have to have at least some cause, like taking my security clearance and giving me no due process whatsoever because I'm perceived as a political enemy, even though I'm not. I may be perhaps an adversary, but I'm not a political enemy because I don't care about politics, other than the fact I can talk it because I live it here in Washington, D.C. And that could very well be where the Supreme Court hits a roadblock with the Trump administration, and the administration says, well, we're not allowing this person to come back into the building. And then what's going to happen?
Where are you at with that particular issue, with your clearance?
Yeah, on my security clearance case, we filed the lawsuit. We had oral arguments back on June 27th. So we're almost at 3 months on an injunction, and the court just hasn't ruled yet. The court system is overwhelmed, especially my district in DC. They have incredibly huge cases. And I mean, we're already at, I think I filed a case last week, and I think it got assigned like 3,256 case filed, just 9 months in. I'm sure we're going to break a record this year. And, most cases are important to someone, that's for sure. And the judge just hasn't gotten around to ruling yet. So we'll see.
Right. Well, this is a good segue into the next subject I want to talk with you about, which is what happened last week at a Senate Health Committee meeting. I wasn't surprised to see you sitting behind recently fired former CDC Director Dr. Susan Monarez, but I was surprised to see a couple of Republican senators grilling her about your role in the case, accusing you of, as you just alluded to, of being critical of Trump, being a political opponent of Trump. Were you expecting that line of questioning?
No, not at all. I don't get it. I really don't. I totally, to segue slightly back on my clearance, because it ties into this. When my clearance was revoked by the president without any due process, I issued a statement Saturday night, because I found out about it at a wedding, from the New York Post, because that's how they notify us nowadays, that I'm like, what took you so long? I mean, I totally expected to lose my security clearance in this administration, even though in his first administration, they increased my access to classified information to higher levels than I had had earlier during the case, during the term. And what I didn't expect was the group among which I lost my clearance. And I still don't understand. I want to say there were like 17 of us named in the presidential order. And I was listed fourth, and it wasn't alphabetical. It wasn't chronologically by age. I have no idea how they figured out what the order was, but it was President Joe Biden. It was Vice President Kamala Harris, the Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco, my colleague Norm Eisen, Andrew Weissman, who people know from MSNBC now, Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney. It was everybody else on the list was either an elected official or been in the government and was political in the government. I have never been, ever. I've never worked for the federal government. I've never been tied to a political party other than when I was in law school 35 years ago in 92, I worked on the Clinton campaign. And I didn't like the politics that I saw. And so I've been a registered independent my entire life. And I've represented the Republican National Committee. I've represented the Daily Caller. I've represented congressional Republicans in Congress. I represent some pretty senior MAGA officials, quite frankly, some of whom it's known publicly, some of not. I'm just a lawyer and will represent cases. I'm not usually driven by a cause other than the rule of law. And there are certain causes that I wouldn't handle. Good for the ACLU to represent the Nazis in Skokie, Illinois back in the late 70s for free speech. Screw the Nazis. I'm not representing Nazis. I draw the line at that. But I totally get the free speech angle and the cause angle, but I'm not driven by that. So when Senator Banks, who quite frankly I had never heard of, I'm always amazed. There's only 100 frickin' senators, and I still look at the list and I'm like, I don't know who this is.
Right. Me too.
I should be able to remember 100 of them. I've never heard of this guy before. I know now, I guess he's from Indiana. And he didn't ask any substantive questions of the witness, which I will say was a bipartisan hearing, one of the few, because Senator Cassidy, Republican chair, who's a doctor, has been incredibly supportive and protective of the CDC. Then you had Rand Paul, who was very in opposition. But hey, the fact that there was the chair in support was fantastic. So then Senator Banks, right? No substantive questions for the witness. It's all about me. Why did I get hired? I'm an anti-Trump lawyer. Didn't she know that? How naive are you, doctor? Why wouldn't you know? Did he call you? Did you call him? And I'm sitting there and I was trying, because I knew I would be on camera sitting behind her. I was making sure throughout the entire hearing, no facial expressions.
You had zero.
Right. And I was told, I smirked at one point, like the first time he said my name, because I was like, what the hell? Seriously? But yeah, I kept my composure and I was just trying to stay steadfast. I don't get it. Like, why you guys are that fixated on me? How threatening am I to you guys? I mean, my buddy Norm Eisen is far more in their face than I am. Which is
I
why
think
Elon
it's
Musk
just
went
to further shape the narrative that there's
Yeah.
this vast left-wing conspiracy, which they apply to everything.
No, and she was the way I usually get my clients. A friend of hers recommended she contact me, but frankly, even before that happened, Abby Lowell, who really did serve as her primary lawyer, Abby brought me in to work on the case, because this is the type of case that I would normally work on anyway. Had nothing to do. I mean, the doctor was confirmed unanimously by the Republican Senate, nominated by Donald Trump, right? Would you think this is someone who I might I mean, she's not really political when it comes down to it. She's a doctor, and she's blinded by science, as the song goes from the 80s, because that's where I'm stuck in by way of music, as I'm told all the time. But the issue was she was fired inappropriately for reasons of this, rejecting science for their personal agenda. That was why. That's the type of issue that I'm involved with. And then, they made such an issue of, and they kept confusing Abby Lowell and I, which was kind of funny, because I wasn't passing any notes. Abby was. And I wasn't whispering in her ear, and Abby was. But that's what the lawyers do at congressional hearings. There's perfectly fine. And yeah, but three senators made an issue apparently. And I had to leave. I'm sure people saw I left, and I'm sure the Republicans think, we scared off Zaid. No, I had a lunch where I was a speaker that I had scheduled weeks earlier with a good friend of mine, Eli Rosenbaum, who was the chief Nazi hunter for the U.S. government and Department of Justice for decades. And I had to get to the speech, and it was just bad timing that I unfortunately had to leave the hearing.
So does Dr. Monarez have a strong case? Is she going to file a suit?
I don't think we've made a final decision. I mean, we were very adamant that Secretary Kennedy could not fire her. She was presidentially appointed, Senate confirmed, so that the secretary did not have the legal authority, which we pushed back on because initially he was going to do it, it seemed. And then the original notification was from a White House personnel officer. And we said, that's not good enough. I'm sorry, if anyone's going to fire her, it's got to be the president of the United States. And then we received notification from the White House counsel that the president had fired her. I don't think a final decision has been made, but it's a stronger case for the government to be able to fire the CDC director than the FTC or the FCC members who have been either their positions are statutorily created or there's due process written into the regulations or the law. She was the first Senate confirmed CDC director. That was a law passed by I guess the Republicans, because I think it was just recently, had to be to have made it through. So we'll see. And we also represented the three other CDC senior medical officials who resigned, but they voluntarily resigned. You could say they were constructively terminated, so they could have a cause of action too. But I think the bigger issue for all of the four is to raise awareness to the notion that the science needs to control decisions that emanate from the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, the Food and Drug Administration, that it can't be by this crazy conspiracy theories that some of these anti-vaxxers and other wackadoodles have. And Dr. Monarez was saying repeatedly, said it at her confirmation hearing, said it during the hearing last week, that, hey, if we're going to make a policy change, just show me the science.
Right. Well, that's the issue. The issue here is policy directives, political policy directives versus science. And that's dangerous. And, our health institutions are in a state of absolute chaos right now, even yesterday with this insanity over Tylenol. But FDA puts out a letter on the Tylenol situation supporting what Trump and Kennedy did. But then within the same document, essentially says the data really isn't there to conclusively prove that there's any connection whatsoever. So it just seems like there's bending of knees everywhere.
Yeah.
With our health in particular makes it really
because
scary.
It fits their conspiracy narratives, right? I mean, clearly RFK in particular has been searching for this, what causes autism. And you know what? We should know what causes autism. We don't. We should be studying what causes it. Can it be treated? How do you address it, etc. But we don't know. But they are committed to, doing whatever they can based on their gut instincts. That's not how it works. It's not how it's supposed to work with respect to science.
So the last thing I want to ask you about is also very important, very consequential, and that is the post that Trump made over the weekend where it seemed he was angry and he brazenly, publicly demanded that Attorney General Pam Bondi prosecute his political opponents. He seemed frustrated that it wasn't happening and certainly wasn't happening fast enough. These opponents include California Senator Adam Schiff, former FBI Director James Comey, and New York Attorney General Tish James. Is this illegal, unconstitutional, impeachable? Do any of these threats have any real legs? I know Comey, I think there's like a statute of limitations that expires next week. So we may see something in the next week. I don't know. But should any of these individuals ever actually be indicted, wouldn't that post really help the defense?
Yeah, selective prosecution defenses are always very difficult, but if they're making it a little bit easier for such an argument. I'm always wondering, one, is this really Trump who's tweeting these things out, right? Or it's some Doge staffer or some really aggressive kid, or Stephen Miller,
Right.
because it always sounds like him. Is he doing it? Did he intend that message to be public, or was it intended to be a direct message? I did that once. It can happen. I did that once, responding to what I thought was responding to someone on Twitter in a direct message, and I didn't realize I actually posted it out. And it was a bad move when I did it. And it was really bad. And I deleted it because it got misinterpreted, what I had said, which is not surprising, because when you're intending it to be in the context of some personal message, the other person will have a better sense of what you're talking about. But this message that Trump tweeted out about, look, we have never seen in any administration I can think of, other than, you look back to Nixon and the Saturday Night Massacre, where he's firing special counsels. We generally have seen a disconnect between the White House and the Department of Justice. Sure, the Attorney General is appointed by the President of the United States, someone who has a generally, not always, a relationship. President Clinton appointed people that he had no relationship whatsoever because somebody recommended them, and maybe he regretted it later on, maybe not, but they were fiercely independent. We don't see that now, obviously. The White House is clearly dictating to law enforcement, which they usually don't do, as well as to the lawyers, which are, of course, part of law enforcement at times. But also in the civil section of the Department of Justice, not just the criminal division or the National Security Division. And so now we also saw, right, the removal. He says he resigned. Trump says he fired the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia.
Yeah, Eric Seibert.
Yep, which was looking at some of the cases, at Letitia James in particular, the New York State Attorney General, whether she committed mortgage fraud. He resigned. He said, look, I can't find any evidence. And he appoints someone with zero experience in criminal law at all. And I will say that district does a lot of terrorism prosecutions. It's a really, really important district. And, it's one of his, frankly, attractive, younger female attorneys who he just likes, who hasn't, like Haba in New Jersey, who has no real experience in any large corporations, overseeing staff, much less criminal, much less even trial experience at times, with a very specific order of go get them, find the evidence. So we'll see. We're seeing pressure put on the U.S. Attorney in the District of Maryland as to whether or not she'll go after John Bolton, whose house, of course, was searched recently through a judicially sanctioned warrant. But we'll see if there's any evidence. Same thing with Comey and some of the others. John Brennan, former CIA director, or Jim Clapper, former director of national intelligence. All these people who are viewed as prominent adversaries. And that's why, again, we're only 8 months into this administration. We'll see. There are certainly crimes that could be charged. I'm always concerned with anyone who has previously had access to classified information and who are talking heads like Brennan and Clapper on the media or in the media, that they could, if the government wants, up what you said the other day about my policy in Russia, that constitutes national defense information, and we're prosecuting you under the Espionage Act. They can do that.
There's a big difference between making threats, making the base happy, and then going into a grand jury to try to get an indictment. And then ultimately, even if you get that indictment, getting a conviction from a jury of 12 people based on evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, it just seems like the goal perhaps isn't to convict. The goal is to scare. The goal is to intimidate. The goal is to have this chilling effect where others remain quiet because it's expensive and it's problematic to be targeted and have to defend oneself.
No, 100%. I think a conviction would just be sort of like the cherry on top of the hot fudge sundae for them. I still enjoy the hot fudge sundae if there's no cherry on it.
Right.
I don't need it. But if you have it, oh, that's awesome. Right? It's the message that's being sent with the search of the homes. That's huge. That is not an inconsequential thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
An indictment, and then go to trial. And it might be embarrassing if they lost, but the impact it would have had along the way of sending a message to others to be quiet or the same will befall you is really, really significant. Now, we have seen in DC, a number of grand juries reject prosecutions arising out of the National Guard being here and arrests made by ICE agents and others. The guy, a DOJ official throwing a Subway sandwich at a federal agent, and the grand jury refusing to indict, and the federal judges decrying or extolling the administration for these ridiculous increased felony charges. Maybe could be a misdemeanor charge. But that's not necessarily going to happen in other jurisdictions. So, right, if I had to give advice to some of my colleagues and friends, or just people who I don't know John Brennan. I've met Jim Clapper over the years, but don't go vacation in Florida and do an interview from there, because that grand jury may be incredibly different, right? You always see when people are interviewed, right? It says where they are. They're on vacation somewhere, or whatever it might be, or traveled for a speech. I mean, you've got to now factor that in to consideration as to where you're traveling around the United States, so as not to give jurisdiction to a particular location. I mean, there's a reason why Trump and the administration, Trump himself, keeps bringing cases in the Middle District of Florida, where Judge Eileen Cannon is, who handled the Mar-a-Lago case,
right.
Or elsewhere within the case that just got thrown out, the defamation. I don't know if it was defamation. It might have been.
I think it was
the New York Times.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, thrown out by a Trump-appointed judge. I've been before the guy. I've liked it. I thought he's done a very balanced job and stuff. Threw the complaint out like 2 or 3 days after it had been filed. You don't normally see that. I mean, you really have to have a judge who's focused and is willing to go out, I'll say, on a limb. It's not, he didn't go over his skis, so to speak. He didn't flout his or exceed his authority, but you typically wouldn't see that happen.
Yeah, well, he said in that particular motion that was filed that it was just loaded with all kinds of like self-aggrandizing victim, woe is me bullshit that had no relevance in the law. And he said, yeah, if you want to come back and refile,
cut it in half
with case law, fine. But so we are seeing that. But is there not grounds for any kind of sanctions or punitive actions the way we saw with Rudy Giuliani? I mean, don't the judges, the courts hate when a lawyer, or especially a government prosecutor, walks into his or her courtroom with bullshit, just cases that have absolutely zero merit?
Yeah, and there have been some. I've actually filed sanctions motions against some of Trump's attorneys. Haven't gotten any because the court just never ruled on them, and or the case got dismissed for which was good for my client, but they never went forward enough. But Alina Habba are now, I don't know if she's considered acting or the U.S. attorney in New Jersey. I guess maybe still acting. Her and a team of Trump lawyers were sanctioned almost $1 million by a Florida federal judge a couple of years ago for frivolous nature of some of their arguments. So there have been some Rule 11 sanctions. Judges are very reticent in the federal system, or maybe anywhere, to do it. It's got to be really blatant. But the more I've said this many times, the right actually kind of created this notion of lawfare, and they would cite to it as the fact that the Democratic administrations, Obama, Congress, Biden administration, would go after Trump with these criminal cases. They flipped it on its head. Lawfare, to me, and I've cited it back to them, is the MAGA abuse and exploitation of civil lawsuits, particularly defamation cases, that they have filed across the country and have lost the vast majority of them. Either they withdraw the case before the case gets finished, like in Michael Flynn's case. He sued one of my clients, Fred Wellman, who used to be in charge of the Lincoln Project. We were defending him pro bono in the Middle District of Florida. And we filed 2 motions to dismiss and for sanctions. And out of the blue, they just dismissed the case. Not the court. Michael Flynn just dismissed the case. Or we're litigating against Rick Grinnell, former ambassador to Germany, the head of the Kennedy Center now, which is a joke. And we've already defeated him in a defamation case. But it's still ongoing because they tried to revive it. But there are countless cases. Devin Nunes has filed many. Kash Patel has filed. His girlfriend now has filed against people. They have filed them everywhere and almost always lose. But there's a cost to filing these cases. There's a personal cost to the person. It's not fun being a defendant in a lawsuit. I've experienced it. Got sued, I think, once or twice by some clients. Not fun. Won both cases, but it's not fun. It's not comfortable. Even though with all the experience I have litigating, not comfortable. Then there's the financial cost. I mean, I always do most of my stuff pro bono for these people, but we'll fundraise. So, I mean, people are paying money, and we're wasting the court's time having to address this when they might have more important things to do.
Right.
So, it's not insignificant, it has an impact in such a way, and it quiets people down without a doubt, because you don't want to be the next victim.
Yeah. Mark, always insightful. Thanks for coming on, and do come back again soon.
Anytime, Andy.
All righty. Take care.